she had never once sat a horse. The wild stallion walked to her anyway. Dakota Territory in the spring of 1876 was a country of endless grass and harder truths than a Philadelphia drawing room had ever prepared Cora Bellweather for, and she arrived at the Kestrel Creek ranch that April with a single trunk, a lawyer's letter, and the unsettling knowledge that she now owned 4,000 acres she had never seen and could not, in any practical sense, actually manage. Cora was 26, the only surviving relation of her great-uncle, Elias Bellweather, a man she had met exactly twice in her life and knew almost nothing about beyond the fact that he had gone west 40 years before under some family cloud never fully explained to her, and had died that winter leaving the whole of his considerable horse ranch to a great niece he had corresponded with only, in stiff, infrequent letters. She had been raised in the particular sheltered fashion of a wealthy Philadelphia family that considered horses a matter for grooms and coachmen rather than young ladies, and had never once, in 26 years, sat astride an animal larger than her own childhood pony, led carefully by a servant's hand around a walled garden. She arrived at Kestrel Creek, accordingly, entirely unprepared for the reality of what she had inherited, a working horse ranch, 40 head of good stock, 3 hired hands, and one animal the whole operation had built its considerable reputation around. His name, according to the ranch's own careful breeding records, was Shadowfax, though the hands simply called him the Ghost, a magnificent gray stallion of wild Mustang blood that Elias Bellweather had captured himself a decade before and had never once fully broken, keeping him instead as a kind of proud, untamed centerpiece to the ranch's operation, a horse no rider had ever successfully sat, and that the old man had loved, by all account, precisely for his refusal to be mastered. The lawyer's letter that had first summoned Cora west had included, among its dry legal particulars, a single personal note from her great-uncle himself, written some months before his death, and left with the solicitor for exactly this occasion. Cora, I write knowing you may never read this, or may read it only after I am gone and past explaining myself further. I left Philadelphia 40 years ago because your grandfather and I could not agree on what a life was for. He believed it was for the careful managing of what a family already possessed, and I believed it was for the earning of something new, however much risk the earning required. I do not know what kind of woman you have grown into. I know only that you are the last Bellweather left who might understand why a man chooses hard, uncertain ground over safe, settled comfort, and I find I would rather leave this place to someone capable of understanding the choosing than to a stranger who would simply sell it for the land's worth alone. Come see it before you decide against it. That is the whole of what I ask. Cora had read that letter a dozen times on the long journey west, and found, standing now at the corral rail with her whole sheltered upbringing rebelling against the fear in her chest, that she understood her great-uncle's strange choosing a great deal better than she had expected to. Cora stood at the corral rail her first full morning at Kestrel Creek, and looked at that enormous gray animal with a fear she did not trouble to disguise, for she understood, plainly and without any romantic illusion, that she was now the nominal owner of an animal that could very likely kill her without the smallest effort. On land she did not know how to work among people who had already, in their first assessing glances, decided she would not last the season. "You'll want to sell him, Miss Bellweather, and the sooner the better," said Jasper Coombs, the ranch's longtime foreman, a broad, weathered man who had worked Kestrel Creek 15 years and had confidently expected, the whole while, that Elias Bellweather's will would eventually name him as heir to the operation he had helped build with his own 2 hands. That horse has put 3 good men in the ground trying to break him, or near enough. He's no use to a woman who's never sat a saddle in her life, begging your pardon for the plain speaking. Best sell the whole operation to a man who can run it properly, and go on back east where you'll be a good deal safer. Cora Bellweather, though genuinely frightened of the animal snorting and wheeling in the corral before her, and though every practical instinct her sheltered upbringing had ever instilled in her urged the wisdom of exactly the retreat Coombs was suggesting, found something in his confident dismissal that stiffened a spine she had not entirely known she possessed. I did not travel 2,000 miles to be told what I cannot do by a man who assumed, until 3 months ago, that this ranch belonged to him by right rather than by will, Mr. Coombs, Cora said, with more steadiness than she felt. I intend to learn what my uncle built here before I decide what to do with it. You may find that considerably more troublesome than a quick sale, but I do not intend to apologize for it. It was Tate Boone, the ranch's quiet, steady horse trainer, a man Elias Bellweather had trusted with the gentling of every difficult animal on the property for the better part of 8 years, though never once with the ghost, whom the old man had kept stubbornly for himself, who watched that whole exchange from the barn door, and found himself, for the first time since the old man's death, genuinely curious about the woman who had just refused to be managed by Jasper Coombs's confident bullying. Tate was 36, solitary by long habit rather than any particular tragedy, a lean, quiet-spoken man who had drifted into Dakota Territory a decade before, with little more than a good horse and a quiet gift for gentling difficult animals, and had found, at Kestrel Creek, the first place in a wandering life that had ever made him want to stay put for longer than a season's wages required. He crossed the yard once Coombs had stalked off toward the bunkhouse and found Cora still standing at the corral rail, her hands white-knuckled on the wood, her whole composed refusal of Coombs's dismissal costing her, he could see plainly, a great deal more courage than her steady voice had let show. "You needn't prove anything to Coombs today, ma'am," Tate said quiet, "or to that horse either, come to that. Both of them will still be here tomorrow." "I am not entirely certain I will be, Mr. Boone." "If I continue standing this close to him," Cora admitted with a shaky attempt at humor that Tate found, despite himself, considerably more endearing than the practiced charm of any Philadelphia drawing-room. "He won't come at you unprovoked," Tate said. "He's wild, not vicious, whatever Coombs would have you believe to scare you off the place. Your uncle spent 10 years just letting that horse get used to being looked at without being grabbed for. I expect that patience is the whole of what your uncle actually left you here, Miss Bellweather, whatever the will says about acreage." Cora looked at the great gray stallion a long moment, and felt, beneath the fear, something else stir that she could not entirely name. A stubborn, unfamiliar refusal to be chased off a thing simply because it frightened her. Before the week was out, Cora Bellweather had decided, against every sensible instinct her sheltered upbringing had ever instilled in her, that she would not sell Kestrel Creek, and that she would not be frightened off her own inheritance by a foreman's confident dismissal, or a wild stallion's reputation either. If a story of a frightened woman learning courage from a wild thing that never once demanded it of her is the kind that keeps you listening, stay. What Cora found in her uncle's own desk that same week changed the whole shape of what came after. She found, going through Elias Bellweather's papers in the small ranch house study, a worn pair of leather work gloves tucked into the bottom desk drawer, cracked and softened by years of honest use, and a single line in her uncle's own careful hand, tucked among his breeding records, the ghost does not want breaking. He wants a person patient enough to simply be present until trust arrives on its own schedule. I have not managed it myself in 10 years. I hope whoever reads this after me has more patience than I did. Cora took up those worn gloves the next morning and walked out to the corral before the ranch had fully woken, and simply stood at the rail, at a careful distance, doing nothing at all but being present, precisely as her uncle's note had instructed, precisely as her own considerable fear made agonizingly difficult. She did this every morning for a fortnight, standing a little nearer each day, saying nothing, asking nothing, simply letting the great gray stallion grow accustomed to her presence the way Tate had once described her uncle's own patient decade of effort. Tate watched from a respectful distance most mornings, offering no instruction unless she asked for it, understanding, with the same quiet patience he brought to every difficult animal, that a frightened woman learning her own courage needed room to find it, rather than a teacher's constant correction. "You are very restrained, Mr. Boone, for a man who could surely teach me a dozen things faster than I am managing them alone," Cora said, one such morning, when Tate had come to check the water trough and found her, as always, simply standing at the rail. "Fastest way to spook a wild thing is to rush it, ma'am," Tate said. "Horse or person both. I've found it generally serves better to let a body find their own pace and just be there if they want the company." "And do you want the company, Mr. Boone?" Cora asked, with a directness that surprised herself as much as it plainly surprised him. Tate considered the question with the same unhurried care he brought to every difficult matter. "I find I have started looking forward to these mornings a good deal more than the ranch work strictly requires, Miss Bellweather," he said finally. "I could not rightly tell you when that started, only that it has. It was on the 16th morning that the ghost finally crossed the corral of his own accord and pressed his great head, gentle as anything, into Cora's outstretched gloved hand, her uncle's own worn gloves, cracked leather against wild horsehide, two patient waitings finally meeting in the middle, and Cora Bellweather stood very still in the Dakota dawn, with tears she did not trouble to hide, understanding, for the first time since she had arrived at Kestrel Creek, exactly what her uncle's strange bequest had actually been. The other hands, drawn by the sight, gathered at a respectful distance to watch, and even old Silas Finn, the ranch's most weathered and skeptical hand, who had told anyone who'd listened for a decade that the ghost would never once be gentled by man or woman either, took off his hat in what looked very near reverence. "He chose you," Tate said, quiet, watching from the rail with something unguarded in his own weathered face. 10 years, and he never once did that for your uncle, patient as the old man was. He's chosen you in a fortnight." "I have not even learned to ride him yet, Mr. Boone," Cora said, laughing through the tears. "That'll come," Tate said. "The choosing was always going to be the hard part." Their own courtship, over the weeks that followed, grew alongside Cora's slow, careful education in the saddle, Tate teaching her, patient and unhurried. First on the ranch's gentlest mare, and only much later, once her confidence had genuinely settled, on the ghost himself, who bore her first tentative, wobbling rides with a gentleness that stunned every hand on the place who remembered his old wild temper. She fell more than once, in those early weeks, bruised and humiliated, and certain, each time that she had proven Coombs entirely right about her unfitness for the life she had inherited, and each time Tate simply helped her up, checked her over for real hurt with a matter-of-fact briskness that never once made her feel pitied, and set her back in the saddle before her own fear could harden into permanent retreat. "I have fallen off this mare 4 times this week alone, Mr. Boone," Cora said, one such afternoon, brushing dust from her ruined riding habit with more frustration than her usual composure generally permitted. I began to suspect Mr. Coombs was rather more right than either of us cared to admit. Coombs never once fell off a horse learning to ride, on account of somebody taught him as a boy of 6, same as most every hand on this place, Tate said. You're learning at 6 and 20 what most folks out here learn before they can properly talk. I'd say 4 falls in a week is considerably better progress than most grown women managing the same feat, and I've seen a fair few try. You are determined to make my failures sound like accomplishments, Mr. Boone. I'm determined to tell you the truth, Miss Bellweather, which happens, in this particular case, to be considerably kinder than the story you're telling yourself. By the end of the second month, Cora could sit a trot without white-knuckled terror, and had begun, on her better mornings, to feel something almost like the easy confidence she had once believed belonged only to people raised to horses from the cradle. Tate found himself, watching her progress, prouder of her small daily victories than he had ever once felt watching even the most talented young hand master a new skill, and understood, somewhere in that quiet pride, exactly how far his own feelings had traveled from simple professional interest. There came an evening, some weeks into that careful teaching, when Cora dismounted after her first real ride and found Tate close at her side to help her down, his hands steady at her waist, and neither of them moved to widen the distance once her feet found the ground. The whole quiet corral held its breath around the narrow space between them, close enough that Cora could see the particular careful tenderness in Tate's tired eyes, close enough that it would have taken nothing at all to close the last of it. I did not expect to find any of this, coming west, Cora admitted, breathless from more than the ride, her hair coming loose from its careful pins in a way that would have mortified her mother's own strict Philadelphia sensibilities, and that she found. Standing there in the dust with Tate's hand still steady at her waist, she did not mind in the slightest. Not the ranch, and certainly not you, Mr. Boone. I did not expect to find a Philadelphia heiress worth staying up nights thinking about, Miss Bellweather, Tate said, low. And yet here we both are. Neither of them closed the distance that particular evening, though both felt exactly how little it would take. And it was Cora who stepped back first, breathless and smiling despite herself. Not yet, she said. I find I would like to be steady in the saddle before I am steady in anything else. I have had enough surprises this season to last several lifetimes. Then I'll wait, Tate said, same as I waited on the ghost. I've found patience generally serves better than rushing, in every particular I've ever tested it against. It was Jasper Coombs who ended that careful patience with considerably less gentleness than either Cora or Tate had shown the wild stallion, having watched, with mounting fury, the ranch's own hands begin to speak with genuine respect of the city heiress who had gentled the ghost, where 10 years of the old man's own patience had fallen short, and having exhausted every honest avenue of persuading Cora to sell the operation he still believed rightfully his, Coombs turned to something considerably more dangerous. He deliberately left a gate open one evening between the ghost's paddock and the working corral, where Cora, growing confident in her new skill, had taken to riding alone in the cool early mornings, timing the sabotage for a morning he knew Tate would be occupied elsewhere on the ranch's far boundary, calculating that a spooked, unfamiliar horse crowding into the same space as an inexperienced rider would produce exactly the kind of accident that might finally convince Cora Bellweather that Kestrel Creek was too dangerous a place for her. He very nearly succeeded. A young, unbroken colt, startled loose through the gate Coombs had left open, came crashing into the working corral at a dead run just as Cora was dismounting from her own morning ride, and the sudden chaos, the colt's panic, the dust, the screaming of two horses in a space too small for the confusion, sent Cora stumbling hard against the rail, her own mount rearing in fright beside her, the flailing hooves of both animals close enough that a single misstep would have ended in tragedy. She threw herself flat against the fence, heart-hammering, certain in that one terrible instant that she would not survive the morning, the whole world narrowed to dust and screaming horseflesh and her own desperate scramble for any solid ground to cling to. It was the ghost himself, pinned in the adjoining paddock and hearing the whole commotion, who put his considerable weight against the fence rail hard enough to splinter it, and came through the gap to place his own great body between Cora and the panicked colt, driving the smaller animal off with nothing but his sheer wild presence. Ears pinned and teeth bared in a display of protective fury the ranch hands would talk about for years after, until the danger had passed and the colt had bolted, still frightened but unhurt, back toward the open range beyond the broken fence. Tate found them that way, Cora shaken but unhurt, pressed against the corral rail with the ghost standing protective and snorting before her, and understood, in the space of a single look at the open gate that ought never to have been open at all, exactly whose hand lay behind the danger. "Coombs left that gate open on purpose," Tate said, grim, once Cora had been settled safely in the ranch house with a cup of strong tea and her own considerable composure slowly returning. "That colt doesn't wander loose on his own, not through a gate that's been latched every day of the 6 years I've worked this place. I mean to have this out with him plain." It was Cora herself, however, who confronted Jasper Coombs, once her hands had stopped their trembling and her fear had settled into something harder and considerably more clear-eyed. "You left that gate open, Mr. Coombs," Cora said, standing in the ranch yard before the assembled hands, her voice steady despite everything the morning had cost her. "I do not know whether you meant to see me killed outright or simply frightened badly enough to sell and leave, and I find, having survived it, that I do not much care which. I know only that my uncle trusted you with this ranch's daily running for 15 years, and you have just proven yourself willing to endanger a person's life over a grievance about inheritance you never had any legal claim to in the first place. You are dismissed, Mr. Coombs, effective this hour, and I will be informing the territorial marshal of the particulars, so that he may decide for himself whether a charge beyond simple dismissal is warranted." Coombs, cornered before the assembled hands who had already begun, over the preceding weeks, to genuinely respect the woman he had once so confidently dismissed, attempted a blustering denial that convinced no one present, least of all the hand who had, it emerged under questioning, seen him near the disputed gate the previous evening, and thought nothing of it until the morning's near tragedy gave the memory its proper weight. Silas Finn, the same weathered old hand who had removed his hat at the sight of the ghost first accepting Cora's touch, spoke up unprompted, his own weathered face hard with disgust at what his longtime foreman had nearly done. "I've worked alongside you 15 years, Coombs, and I never once thought you'd stoop to endangering a body's life over a grudge about who got left what in a will. You ought to be ashamed, and I find I'm ashamed to have called you a friend this long without seeing it coming." He left Kestrel Creek within the day, and the marshal, informed of the whole affair, judged the reckless endangerment serious enough to warrant a formal charge that saw Coombs spend the better part of a year in the territorial jail, his own ambition for the ranch costing him considerably more than the inheritance he had once believed himself owed. It was that same evening, with the danger fully past and the ranch settling back into its ordinary rhythm, that Tate Boone found Cora once more at the corral rail, the ghost standing calm and watchful beside her, as though he understood plainly that his own fierce protection had settled something important that morning. I have spent 8 years at this ranch, believing patience was the whole of what I had to offer anyone, Tate said, taking her hand, careful of the healing scrape along her palm from the morning's chaos, the ghost shifting his great weight beside them as though he too understood the weight of the moment. I find, watching that horse put himself between you and real danger today, that I want considerably more than patience for myself. I want to spend the rest of my life exactly here, beside you, whatever this ranch or this territory decides to throw at either of us next. I have watched a sheltered Philadelphia woman arrive terrified of the whole wide world she'd inherited and turn herself, one patient morning at a time, into someone this whole territory has learned to respect. I do not think I have ever admired anyone the way I have come to admire you this season. He drew a steadying breath. Will you marry me, Cora? Not because the ghost chose you first, though I confess he has better judgment than most people I have known. Because I choose you too, plainly and entirely, and I find I have been waiting rather longer to say so than either of us has let on. The kiss she gave him then, with the ghost's warm breath stirring the dust at their feet, was quiet and certain, and what broke open in Cora was the plain astonishment of a sheltered Philadelphia life finally, entirely left behind for a courage she had not known, 6 months before, that she possessed at all. Word of the whole affair traveled through the territory with the particular speed such stories always found, and Kestrel Creek's reputation, once built entirely on old Elias Bellweather's stubborn reclusiveness, grew instead into something the surrounding ranches spoke of, with genuine respect. A heiress who had arrived unable to sit a horse, and had, within a single season, gentled the territory's most notorious stallion, and faced down a foreman's deliberate treachery without once considering retreat. More than one skeptical neighbor who had privately wagered on how quickly the Philadelphia woman would sell out and go home found themselves, by autumn, offering genuine congratulations instead. Silas Finn and the other hands, who had watched the whole season unfold with growing loyalty, stayed on at Kestrel Creek under Cora and Tate's joint management, and the ranch's breeding operation, freed at last from Coombs's resentful mismanagement, prospered in the years that followed under a partnership considerably more honest than anything the old foreman's ambition had ever offered the place. They were married that autumn at Kestrel Creek. The whole ranch turned out to witness it, and the ghost himself stood saddled and calm at the edge of the ceremony, for Cora had insisted the horse who chose her first ought to see the choosing through to its proper end. Cora rode him herself down the makeshift aisle between the assembled hands and neighbors, her uncle's worn gloves on her hands for the occasion, a small private tribute to the man whose strange bequest had given her a life she had never once imagined wanting. She kept her uncle's worn leather gloves on the mantel of the ranch house study ever after, framed rather than worn on ordinary days, a reminder of the fortnight she had spent simply standing at a corral rail, learning that some of the truest things in this world could not be rushed, hurried, or bought, only waited for, patiently, until trust arrived entirely on its own schedule. Their own children, born in the years that followed, grew up learning to ride almost before they could properly walk, though Cora made certain each one of them heard, in time, the whole story of the mother who had arrived at 6 and 20, unable to sit a horse at all, so that they might understand plainly that the skills a person is born without are never the whole measure of what they might yet become, given patience enough, and someone willing to simply stand nearby while the learning happened. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where courage arrived not through grand declaration, but through the patient work of simply staying present, then this story was for you. Out on the wide grass of Dakota, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Tate Boone and the woman a wild stallion chose before any person thought to become the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real. She had never once ridden a horse. She learned and was chosen, and never once looked back toward the sheltered life she had left behind. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, doubt, and the kind of quiet courage only the West seems to demand speak to something in you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here, the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.